As was predicted, Ukraine's Kherson counteroffensive fell flat on its face. However, as I'm sure that many of you know, Ukraine has had a lot more success in another counteroffensive that took place near the city of Kharkov. And it is not an exaggeration to say that Ukraine has been dizzy with success this entire week. In this video, I would like to talk a little bit about some of the reasons for this success and for the massive failure on the part of the Russians in not doing anything to avert this, what has now become an operational crisis. And I would also like to give some passing thoughts on what this might mean for the Russian special military operation as a whole. But first, a brief rundown of events that happened over the last 4 days. Ukraine's counteroffensive near the city of Kharkov started near the town of Balakleya, and on its first day saw about 1,500 Ukrainian soldiers, primarily from lightly armed units, penetrate the Russian defenses in the area and pass deep into the Russian rear. And on its very first day, this offensive saw Ukrainian units advance as much as 20 to 30 kilometers behind what were previously the front lines. And it's worth noting that the Ukrainians started this offensive in an area of the front line which was only protected by conscripts from the LPR and the DPR, as well as by some National Guard units from Russia, which are basically a glorified police force. That is to say, these lightly armed, highly mobile Ukrainian units faced very little resistance, and anywhere that they did face even token resistance on the first day, they pretty much avoided. Therefore, they were able to bypass many fortifications, many towns that were at the time still controlled by the Russians, and therefore penetrate 20 to 30 kilometers into the Russian rear, and pretty much sow chaos there behind the Russians' front lines. And here I should mention that the reason that these Ukrainian forces were able to sow such chaos among the Russian rear are that, first of all, these were highly trained units, or at least units that were by and large far better trained and better equipped than your statistically average Ukrainian soldier. And second of all, they were equipped with much better communication systems and had superior communications protocols, overall better communications than the Russian units. One of the things that has been dragging down Russia in this war is a lack of communication. And this means that whenever a Russian soldier sees one of these mobile Ukrainian units, that soldier is unable to call in for urgent artillery or air support, and by the time that support does arrive, these mobile units have already gone. Then, over the next several days, more heavily armed Ukrainian units entered the battle in greater numbers and began exploiting this gap in the Russian defenses. And over the next day, the town of Balakleya, as well as some other settlements nearby, were surrounded by the Ukrainian forces and were quickly abandoned by the Russians. I should emphasize that there was some fighting, but it was nothing like the heavy fighting that we see whenever the Russians attack some town that is controlled by the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians fight tooth and nail for it. Instead of doing that, the Russians quickly withdrew after some minor fighting. They withdrew in order to avoid an encirclement. And the following day after this, an emergency security council meeting was convened inside of Russia, and presumably this is where the decision to abandon the territories that were previously held by Russian forces in all of Ukraine's Kharkov region, located west of the Oskil River, took place. That is to say, the Russian forces, as well as the militias of the LPR and DPR, have now completely withdrawn from this area of Ukraine. And only on the fourth day of this Ukrainian offensive, the Russian Ministry of Defense came out with a statement, a very brief statement, which essentially said that the withdrawal from Kharkov region was a pre-planned military maneuver that was meant to fool the enemy and yada yada. which is of course complete garbage. Events on the ground clearly show that this withdrawal was not pre-planned, although, to the Russians' credit, it was conducted in a somewhat organized manner with minimal military casualties. But make no mistake, despite the fact that combat losses among Russian military personnel were fairly low, and that combat losses among Ukrainian personnel in this offensive were much higher, mainly due to the fact that Russian military aircraft were flying missions 24/7 over the course of several days, bombing the Ukrainians, this does not change the overall picture. The overall picture is that this was a massive strategic blunder for Russia, essentially the biggest L that the Russian military has received in all of Russia's modern history. And likewise, it is a very big strategic victory for Ukraine, not to mention the fact that this victory comes at a time up until which things have been looking rather bleak. Well, given the very successful Kharkov offensive that Ukraine has carried out, things are now looking much better in the eyes of your average Ukrainian soldier and also in the eyes of the political and military leadership both in Kiev and in the collective West. In fact, this is the single biggest victory that Ukraine has achieved in this entire war, starting from the 24th of February. And the overall strategic picture is that the Russians lost territory. Territory where hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom were pro-Russian, resided. And many of these people, especially those who collaborated with the Russian forces in some way, either in administrative roles or in distributing humanitarian aid or in simply expressing their support in some way, shape, or form for Russia, these people who are now located in the territories that the Russians refer to as formerly liberated territories, their lives are now in danger. And here I have to mention that over the last couple of days, there has been a number of fairly disturbing messages, announcements in various pro-Ukrainian internet spaces, chat groups, Telegram channels, particularly those that lean more towards the far right, representatives of organizations like Right Sector, Azov, Kraken, Misanthropic Division, and many others, all calling for alleged collaborators to be located and dealt with, presumably executed. I have also heard reports of 93 school teachers from the town of Balakleya who, as I understand, went to Russia in order to become acquainted with the new school program that is approved by Russian authorities, according to which they were supposed to teach the school children of the town of Balakleya, and all of these 93 teachers have reportedly now been arrested by the SBU. So this is what all of the civilians who have expressed some pro-Russian opinions or have worked with Russia in some way, shape, or form during the time that the Russian soldiers were in the area near Izium and Balakleya are now going to have to deal with. Of course, there are also other people who have elected to flee the area and to move inside Russia, to leave everything behind at a moment's notice and flee immediately beyond the Russian border. And we have video footage of thousands and thousands of cars standing in a line which stretches for many kilometers, awaiting to pass the checkpoint at the Russian border. And this is where the real problem for Russia's strategy emerges. The real problem is not in the military defeat itself, not in any military losses, except of course for the fact that some territory was indeed lost and some equipment, some stockpiles of ammunition had to be abandoned during the hasty, albeit somewhat organized retreat. But that is not the main issue. The main issue is that Russia went into these territories, promised to everyone that Russia was there to stay, and promptly got up and left, leaving hundreds of thousands of civilians who are residents of these areas essentially to their own fates, throwing them to the wolves that are the Azov, Kraken battalions, and the SBU. And of course, all of this has severely undermined the faith of other pro-Russian individuals in Russian-controlled territories of Ukraine, who are now asking themselves if the Russians can do this so easily to the area in Kharkov region, what says that they won't do it in Zaporozhye region, in Kherson region, perhaps even in Donetsk and Lugansk regions sooner or later as well. Especially given the fact that something like this has already happened before, way back in late March, when the Russians withdrew from Kiev, Chernigov, and Sumy, and left the pro-Russian populations of these areas to the proverbial wolves in much the same manner. So this is more or less the situation on the ground. Now, to answer the question, why did this happen? As I mentioned previously, the military aid of the collective West, both in equipment and in training, played a significant role. The Ukrainians were able to get behind the front lines of the Russian defenses and sow chaos there with these highly mobile groups. Now, this was possible for two reasons. The first reason is that Russian communications up until now and including right now have indeed been somewhat poor. The other reason is that the size of the Russian force in Ukraine is simply not very large. The Russian force in Ukraine, if we are being very generous, numbers perhaps 200,000 Russian professional military servicemen. This is not including the conscripts and professionals from the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. However, if we were to give more realistic estimates, or perhaps estimates which are more commonly cited on the internet in various places, the size of the Russian force currently deployed in Ukraine is probably somewhere closer to 100,000. This is not a large number, especially given the fact that the total size of the Russian military, even if we were to only look at professional military servicemen, is around 500,000. And consider for a moment the fact that as this Ukrainian offensive was happening, 50,000 Russian military servicemen were busy conducting the Vostok 2022 exercises on the literal opposite end of the planet in the Russian Far East. All of this and many others are examples of how Russia simply hasn't deployed 100% of its regular peacetime military into Ukraine. In fact, it hasn't deployed anywhere near 100% of its military into Ukraine. In the minds of the Russian military and political leadership, this is not a war. This is a special military operation, which, by definition, entails a limited scope. However, in the minds of the Ukrainians and in the minds of the collective West, which is backing Ukraine, this is by no means a limited operation. The Ukrainians and the collective West are going pretty much all in. And while I am primarily bringing up examples of the number of military servicemen deployed here and there, it should also be mentioned that the Russians haven't deployed the best of their military equipment either. There are plenty of reports of the Russian military using BMP-1s, BMP-2s, T-72 tanks, while significantly more modern T-90 tanks, BMP-3s, and other equipment is involved in things like the tank biathlon competition. And all of this is in turn symptomatic of the fact that the Russian political and military leadership have, up until now, not treated this war as quite the serious matter that it perhaps is. Paradoxically enough, the Russian military and political leadership, despite having chosen the exact time and date of its military invasion of Ukraine, despite having fired the first shots in this war, has, over the last almost 7 full months, treated this war like it's a sideshow, while Ukraine, backed by the collective West, has gone all in. In my opinion, this situation is unsustainable. So what Russia is going to have to do, and is going to have to do fairly soon, is expand the scope of its military operation in Ukraine, but also pay more attention to many of the other deficiencies that have been unveiled in how the Russian military operates over the course of this war. The issue with communications is just one of a very, very long list, and I predict that sooner or later it is going to be fixed, and when this happens, the efficiency in how the Russian military operates, in Russian artillery strikes, in Russian airstrikes, is going to increase by orders of magnitude. Now, I don't know exactly when this is going to happen, exactly when these changes are going to be introduced into the Russian military. Frankly, I think that it is quite surprising, shocking even, that they haven't already been introduced, but I can say with confidence that sooner or later things will change. Things will change because, simply put, Russia and the Russian leadership has no other choice. This war is rapidly becoming a war not just for the survival of Ukraine, but for the survival of Russia. Consider the fact that we've seen many forums and meetings by representatives of the various governments of the collective West talking about the quote-unquote de-imperialization and decolonization of Russia, which essentially means balkanizing Russia, dividing it into many small, easily controlled republics, statelets, divided by their ethnic and racial lines. Combined with the fact that we have statements from the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, Mr. Reznikov, talking about the fact that a peace deal with Russia will only be possible when Russia surrenders all the territory that Ukraine considers its own, which of course includes Crimea. And on top of this, you have the talk of reparations and many other unfavorable conditions which will be imposed upon Russia if it does not succeed in its quote-unquote special military operation in Ukraine. All of this points towards the simple fact that Russia has no choice but to succeed. So, to summarize, I think the fact that all of these cans of worms which have been unveiled within the Russian military over the course of the special military operation over the last 7 months, that many of these issues have not been fixed, I think is indicative of, simply put, incompetence on some level or another within the Russian military and political leadership. But sooner or later, I'm not going to try and guess exactly when, Russia is simply not going to have any choice but to fix these issues. Finally, a few words about some other events that have taken place in the Ukraine war over the last few days besides this much talked about Kharkov counteroffensive. Firstly, we have news of pro-Russian units, primarily from the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, along with some Chechen battalions, and also units from the Wagner organization, advancing towards the Ukrainian-held city of Bakhmut. It appears that Russian operations in this area are aimed at surrounding the city rather than storming it head-on, and they are slowly but surely making progress. It is believed that their progress has been sped up a little bit by the fact that the Ukrainians have been forced to redeploy many of their soldiers, as well as artillery guns and armored vehicles, from other front lines in order to participate in the Kharkov offensive. We also have some news about what appears to have been a fairly significant, a fairly large Ukrainian offensive on Pesky in Donetsk region, which has so far been defended successfully by the Russian soldiers and the soldiers of the Donetsk and Lugansk militias there. Some other news which I consider very important and an indicator of how the Russians are slowly starting to take this war a little bit more seriously than before. This news came in just as I was recording this video. Apparently, Russian missile attacks launched from ships in the Black Sea and also from strategic bombers have now, on the 7th month of the war, begun to target Ukrainian infrastructure. Right now, all we know is that a bunch of Ukrainian power plants across many different regions of Ukraine, from Kharkov to Dnipropetrovsk to Odessa and Nikolaev and many others, have been targeted, and that many Ukrainian cities are currently without power. This is a clear step that Russia is moving away from this concept of a special military operation and is slowly upping the intensity of the war in Ukraine. And of course, this is very important because things like railroads, military production facilities, repair facilities, all the factories that are involved in a military industrial complex, granted, nearly all have been destroyed by Russian missile strikes in Ukraine a long time ago, but also other things such as administrative facilities, administrative works, even things like recruitment facilities, communications, all need electricity to function. And by taking out the electricity, the Russians are depriving the Ukrainians of many of these things. And of course, this begs the question, does this mean that the Russians are now also going to start targeting other Ukrainian infrastructure, such as the bridges that cross the Dnieper River, such as other bridges all over Ukraine, such as various regional and municipal administrative centers, the Ukrainian Rada, and so on, many structures which they have up until now refrained from targeting. And lastly, we have an increasing number of reports over the last few days of an imminent Ukrainian offensive focused near the town of Ugledar in Donetsk region. We have reports of Ukrainian soldiers taking down their own minefields, demining their own minefields that they have laid previously, presumably in preparation for an offensive, and we also have reports of various equipment and armored vehicles arriving on the Ukrainian side close to Ugledar. Well, all that can be said about this is that we will simply have to wait and see how this battle unfolds. In conclusion, I thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please be sure to leave a like, and also a reminder that you can find other content that I post, primarily written messages, text-based messages, on my Telegram channel, the link to which is, as always, in the link in the description. I wish you all a wonderful day.